Lopez. Cynthia Lopez is an executive producer, creative consultant, and indie media consultant. She's a former New York City Film Commissioner, as well as prior to that, she was the co-executive producer of POV at PBS. Just some housekeeping notes for you. Please do take this moment to silence your phone. Just remember there is no recording of any of our foundation events. And if you received a question card, and a question pops up in your mind during the course of the discussion, we'll be running around to collect those about halfway through, and we'll hand those to the moderator. So please do take a moment to write those questions. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge Rebecca Damon, who is the Foundation Board Vice President and Executive VP of SAG-AFTRA, is in the house, as well as SAG-AFTRA President Gabrielle Carteris, who I'd like to welcome to the stage for a few words.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for that. Wow, I was just here last week. So, what an incredible panel and event for this evening. I also want to say thank you to Rebecca Damon, the Executive Vice President, to the board members of New York who are here tonight, to the SAG-AFTRA Foundation for making this happen, and for our staff who's worked so hard. This is an important conversation, and it is a conversation that we as SAG-AFTRA are going to be having on a regular basis. We are living in a time that, you know, I've been doing press a lot recently, and everybody keeps talking about our industry and this issue that's taking place, and I keep saying this is not an issue of our industry. This is systemic within our culture and on a global level. And we must empower our members, not only to be able to protect themselves when something is happening and to give them voice and take them out of the isolation and that feeling of shame, but how do we go and protect our members so they have voice, so they can prevent things from happening? And that's partly due to the ability for us to give education and outreach. So this is a night of empowerment. It is an ongoing night of empowerment. As we move through this process, we are changing in our industry. We have to be able to speak of what is happening so that we can change the culture. It is truly an honor to be here tonight. And the panel that you have is a wonderful panel that was just mentioned. You're going to hear more from them. But I just want to say that, you know, it was in New York that some of the first courageous voices spoke out of our membership to really bring this out. You should. And I want to give honor to those voices because, as I said before, there is so much shame and isolation attached to sexual harassment. And in order for us to be able to change that, we must be able to speak out. So I do want to welcome Cynthia Lopez, our moderator, who's going to help give us voice for this evening. And she will introduce the panel. But again, thank you for being here. It is an honor to be able to be a part of this conversation, and I look forward to us changing the culture because that is what we must do if we want things to be better. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. How are we doing tonight? How are we doing? Complex times, right? I have to say thank you so much to SAG-AFTRA Foundation, to SAG-AFTRA, to the Writers Guild of America, to the Producers Guild of America for hosting this evening. It is so difficult in challenging times. They've had an unwavering commitment in fostering positive change and in supporting creative talent. And it is during these times when we come together as a field that we know that it is time for change, right? And so I have to say, earlier this week, I had the luxury of experiencing a small group of women who were coming together for Ms. Magazine's 45th anniversary. Gloria Steinem was present for her birthday, and to commemorate the occasion, the New York City Council named 32nd Street Ms. Magazine Way. Gloria gave an uplifting talk about the status of women today. She explained that more women are in positions of power than ever before and are changing the culture and how things are done. She also explained that women are fighting for equal rights and that women are speaking out against violence in every shape and form. And she said, ladies, even though we don't have a woman in the presidency, we don't have a woman in the White House, you need to understand the strides that we have made. She said, women are more courageous than ever before. She said, look at what the women in Hollywood and media are doing. They are standing up and finally speaking out. And guess what? They're actually being heard. So I have to say thank you to the New York membership, because it is very delicate and dubious times in which we live. And when I was preparing for this panel, I kept on looking for words to describe how can I open the panel. And one of the things that I did was look up the word crisis, right? And I found a Chinese definition to crisis, and I enjoyed what it said. It says, when written, the word crisis in Chinese has two symbols, danger, and the other symbol means opportunity. I believe this is what is at the heart of today's conversation. It is about what the entertainment industry needs to do in terms of recognizing this crisis and creating opportunities to do things differently. And that's what the organizations here that are represented are doing. Now, I was told to talk a little bit about our goals and objectives this evening. So first, I'd like to say that we'd like to have a candid conversation about what each of the guilds and industry organizations represented here this evening are doing currently and what they'd like to do moving forward. The second goal that we have is that this conversation is for informational purposes. And while this evening is not to serve as a place for confidential information, if you will, panelists will describe specific procedures and resources. So should anyone in the room need help, there is literature and information, and the people who will be at the panel can definitely assist in terms of where you can get help. The third thing that we want to talk about is that this gathering is just the beginning of many more conversations that are about to come. So without further ado, I would just like to bring up Laura Chanel, who has more than 30 years experience as an attorney, and she will speak to us a little bit about the legal terminology of sexual harassment, what it means under the law, before we bring the entire panel up.
Good evening. When I started law school in 1980, sexual harassment wasn't part of the vocabulary, and it really wasn't part of the law. Feminist scholars had just at that point started developing a concept that sexual harassment should be part of what is Title VII, discrimination in employment on the basis of sex. By 1986, the Supreme Court agreed, and since then, the federal courts and the EEOC and many, many states and city agencies as well have enforced the law that sexual harassment is a kind of sex discrimination. You won't find it in the statute, but that is what it is. Sexual harassment is a kind of sex discrimination in employment. It also, in academia, there's another law, Title IX, that also prohibits sexual harassment. What is sexual harassment? There's generally not understood to be kind of two types. One is what's referred to as quid pro quo, this for that. That's the kind everybody can understand easily. You sleep with me and you get the promotion. You sleep with me and you don't get the promotion. Either way, it's illegal sexual harassment, a conditioning submission to on an adverse or a positive or a negative employment action. The other kind is usually referred to as hostile work environment, and that's more complicated and it's more difficult to both articulate and to pursue. That is if having to endure unwelcome, and that's the most important word, unwelcome, verbal, physical, written conduct of a sexual nature that either unreasonably affects or interferes with your ability to perform your job, or that creates a hostile work environment. Unwelcome is the operative under both kinds, but unwelcome is not the same thing as what one understands, for example, a rape. Unwelcome means you don't want it, but if you submit, it still can be unwelcome. So in other words, you don't have to scream if somebody dives in for a kiss for it to be unwelcome. The other concept for the environmental sexual harassment is that the courts generally and the agencies also have said it has to be either severe or pervasive. Now, you might hear sometimes people saying severe and pervasive, and that's wrong. Severe or pervasive. Now, what does that mean? You could probably read, 2,000 decisions of courts, and there's different answers by everybody. But what essentially it means, severe is bad, right? And pervasive means a lot of it. So lots of terrible sexist jokes that you have to endure on a daily basis, severe. Somebody diving, putting their hand down your shirt once, probably pervasive. The other important concept everybody needs to understand is all the laws that prevent sexual harassment also have an anti-retaliation provision. And so the law is very clear that if one complains about sexual harassment or any kind of discrimination, indeed, you cannot be retaliated against. And you don't have to be right about the sexual harassment to have a right not to be retaliated against. You could, for example, be wrong about whether it's severe or pervasive enough, but the law says that if you have a good faith belief that what you are experiencing, or indeed what some other person is experiencing, because you have a right not to be retaliated against if you complain or report sexual harassment against another, you should not be retaliated against, and retaliated against includes any kind of, again, adverse employment action, whether it's suspension, termination, demotion, not getting a bonus or not getting a role, or any of those things. The most other important thing to understand is, again, this concept is for employment. It protects employees, not, some guy on the street, makes a pass at you. That's not sexual harassment that's prevented by the law. On the other hand, whether the employer calls you an employee or not is not dispositive. In other words, the courts will look at the actual reality of the economic relationship to determine whether you're an employee under the law that is protected. And then finally, the person doing the harassment does not have to be an employee. It could be a vendor. You can work in a restaurant. It could be the customers. And if you have to endure as a condition of your job sexual harassment, you are protected. I will be around, so I can elaborate on more of this, but I think that's the... So one other thing I wanted to add. It's not just men and women on women. It's women on men, women on women, men on men, sexual orientation, harassment. It's all covered. So, and that the Supreme Court ultimately made that clear too.
Thank you. Well, we want to bring up the panel, and we'll start with Lillian Gallina. She's the social work supervisor for the Actors Fund. Welcome, Lillian. Adam Moore, who's the National Director and EEO and Diversity for SAG-AFTRA. Welcome, Adam. Lowell Peterson, who's the Executive Director for the Writers Guild East. Welcome, Lowell. Lydia Pelcher, National VP for Motion Pictures Producers Guild of America. Welcome. And we've heard from Laura. I am not going through everyone's extensive bio. I have to say they all are so impressive in terms of what they've accomplished. The full bios are online on the web, so I just want to sort of jump in and ask some questions. And pardon me, I'll be sitting and standing. I had a recent car accident, so I just have to be careful. But maybe we will start with Lowell. Lowell, tell us a little bit about what the Writers Guild of America East is doing currently, and just give us a snapshot of what you're engaged in.
Well, we are, to pick up on your word from the introduction, in crisis mode, mostly looking at it from the perspective of what is it that the members expect and need, and what are the members themselves willing to do. Our first step is to talk extensively with our members. We're going to do a survey of our members. We are going to have meetings with our members. The second thing we're going to do is make sure that our staff is trained, because we will be making resources available to members and say, one of the things we want you to do is contact the union and make sure that the union can direct you to the proper resources or do other things that I'll talk about in a second. But in order for that to be meaningful, we have to have our staff learn a lot more, not just about the legal principles, which are critical, but also about other resources that are available, and how to have real conversations with people in very difficult circumstances. This is not a garden variety grievance situation. This is a situation that can be extraordinarily complicated emotionally. It can involve, let's be honest with ourselves, friends, it can be another member who's involved. We have to know how to think about and talk about these issues before we pretend that we're a major resource. But I will, in addition to gathering the resources and of course making sure that the employers are following their responsibilities. At the end of the day, as Laura said, it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that you can work in an atmosphere that's free from not only sexual harassment as legally defined, but other forms of sexual violence and inappropriate conduct. We are thinking about ways to engage our members in this process that are not limited to file a claim, file a grievance, file a lawsuit, but that actually address the deeper issues that we know exist. These, you know, Harvey Weinstein didn't invent sexual harassment, and it has been years and years of construction of legal doctrines and legal remedies to address this horrible problem. And nonetheless, it is still a pervasive problem, a severe and pervasive problem. And we have to ask ourselves, honestly, why is that true? Part of it may be a lack of knowledge. It may be that the employers are not following the obligation that they have to make sure that their supervisors and employees and vendors are trained. It may be that the employer's mechanisms for redress are inadequate. It may be that our members don't have enough information about what's available and what can be done. And certainly we think it's our responsibility as a union to correct all of those things. But there's an additional possibility, and that is that those legal remedies are not adequate. And that we are going to spend a lot of time talking about in at least two forums. One is exploring with our members the extent to which they want to participate in a deeper cultural change. Creating communities of support and activism and resistance that go beyond claim and enforcement. We haven't asked our members yet, but my bet is that members will be very interested in pursuing that. And the other one, which we also have to be honest with ourselves about, is the enormous imbalance of power in the industry. We think that the union's diversity efforts, which are extensive, are integral to battling sexual violence at work. It wouldn't be as big a problem if the fact is that 18% of TV writers are women. If it was 50%, this would be a different kind of conversation we'd be having. You know, if diversity efforts like the fellowship that you worked with us on when you were at the city, like tax credit that all the unions are working on in Albany, and ongoing efforts to rectify this stunning diversity gap, all of that is, in the long run, going to be important to preventing sexual violence as well.
Thank you, Lowell. Lydia, talk to us a little bit about the Producers Guild of America and what you're engaged in doing.
Okay, thank you. The Producers Guild of America represents 8,000 producers nationally, and we're 50-50, men and women. And I'm very thankful that our board is 18 men and 20 women. So we have a very strong guild in terms of our commitment to diversity as part of our larger agenda. And we have a Women's Impact Network that has been very involved for a long time in promoting gender equity in the business. So one of our first projects was the Ms. Factor Toolkit, which was all about the power of female-driven content, which, believe it or not, was a necessary case to make at the time. And when we finished that project, what we realized in terms of the next realm of our work was systemic bias. And it's explicit, it's implicit, it's unconscious, but it's bias. And so the project that we've undertaken, we actually started this project last year, so it preceded this flashpoint in our culture, but is very much related to the flashpoint. To work on a project, it's called Culture Shift. We have put some handouts in the lobby if anybody wants to take a look. And it's a project that we're engaged in over the process of this year to create a resource whereby people can look through a checklist or a lens and really evaluate bias in our content, because it's not something that we all are necessarily keyed into. But we do know that culture resides in the realm of ideas and images and stories, and it is really the narrative that we live in every day. So the idea that the normalization of hypersexualized female, images, roles, stories on screen is very much connected to discrimination and sexual abuse is real. And there's a lot of statistics from Common Sense Media that really look at the role that gender bias plays starting at very early ages, really sinking in the ages 7 to 14, which is very young for our children. So we were happy to participate tonight because we think the culture piece is really important. We think as we strategize for initiatives going forward, the culture piece has to be considered, and we look forward to talking about that tonight.
Well, I have to say I was so impressed when I read all of the materials for culture shifts, and I was thinking, I spent 15 years at PBS, and every year there was a creative gathering of everyone who produced for PBS, and I kept on thinking, we have to get this flyer into each of the packets for those creatives. And I'm sure everyone on this panel has information that we can share in that way, because often what I found, even as commissioner, when I was commissioner here in New York City, is that these projects, just getting the information out, the production schedule is so tough to get stuff done. So getting this information out so people could really use it in a very viable way is going to be very impressive moving forward, to be able to see these shifts and these changes for sure. Now, I wanted to ask Gallina, Lillian, to speak to us a little bit from a social work supervisor perspective. I thought this was fascinating from my perspective. I said, the Actors Guild has a social worker supervisor, so they must have more social workers because there's a supervisor. And so I said, okay. I said, but I hate to say this, but I was like, I wonder what she does and how she does it, and do most people know that you exist and your whole team exists? So I'm going to ask a silly question. Great. And talk to us a little bit about what it is you do.
Thank you. Well, at the Actors Fund, we are a human services organization that serves all professionals in performing arts and entertainment, behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, around the scenes. And we're really here to support you both individually, to kind of in a lot of different ways with your work and life balance, as well as in different parts of your life. So in our social services department, we have a lot of social workers actually, and we provide free confidential counseling to professionals in the entertainment industry if they might be facing a personal challenge, a work challenge, and we're going to provide that, and then provide other services as well, referrals, longer-term care, both group support as well as individual support, and perhaps even get them into some of our other excellent programs. So in terms of addressing the specific issue of sexual harassment, we continue to be a support for the individual, right? In the entertainment industry, if you're experiencing sexual harassment and you need a safe, confidential place to talk, to think about it. There's so many factors and decisions and feelings that arise, and we're here for that. We're here for you to do that. And then also really wanting to, be a voice around the realities of the entertainment industry. It's such an incredible industry, and it does face some particular challenges when it comes to this particular issue. The workplace is a very dynamic workplace, and it doesn't look like most traditional workplaces. And what are those challenges? How do we as the individual in the industry, understand and manage those challenges? How do we educate ourselves on our rights as employees, even despite the fact that we might have multiple employers, sporadic work? What are our rights as an employee? So we're hoping to give that information out and support the unions in educating their members as well.
Thank you. Well, Adam, you have the dream job. You have a tough job, but the dream job. So tell us a little bit about
to think so.
What you do at SAG-AFTRA and what's happening now, just given the circumstances?
Sure. Thank you. So as I have the privilege of leading the Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Department at SAG-AFTRA, and as many of you know, with 160,000 members that give voice and face to the stories that are created from my colleagues here, it is the most visible workplace on the planet. As bizarre as the workplace might be, as you alluded to, people get an opportunity to see who's working and who's not. What are those stories that are told? How authentic are those stories? How hypersexualized are those stories? How inauthentic, how stereotypical those are? And so what we try to do in general is encourage greater levels of inclusion throughout the entire process, to reach the most authentic stories possible and to be inclusive as possible, to ensure equal access to job opportunities, and to provide protection when people are pursuing jobs and on the job itself. These last 5 weeks have put the protection piece of that in sharp relief, as a lot of what we've talked about already is that power dynamic, that real or perceived power that someone might have and wield over someone else. This is societal, as President Carteris mentioned. That exploitation of that power is not limited to our industry, but is certainly the most visible, I think. It's something that people see these people and see these stories, and they're in your homes, and you kind of grow up with some of these people, and you feel a connection to them in a way that doesn't happen in other workplaces that are closed to folks in that visible way. And so there is, I think, a special obligation for those of us in this industry to really recognize that there is a leadership role to be played in this industry, to not only let people know what it is that's available to them in terms of recourse and recovery from the trauma that they experience, but also to try to have that culture shift, to use the work that we're all a part of and that you all are a part of to really change the narrative, to give people alternative examples about normative relationships, right? What's okay and what's not. A lot of times you get to understand that and are kind of indoctrinated with that on what you see on screen. It's unfortunate that our union has had to have in place for quite a while processes and procedures for when people come to the union with these circumstances of someone said that if I did something for them, that they would do something for me. And it is very real. That power imbalance is potentially one of the most extreme of any workplaces, where someone can make or break you in a moment, can actually make or ruin you in a moment. And having to make those decisions is, even if you find yourself not being assaulted, having to go through that trauma and understand that this might be the way that it just is. And for a long time, you hear that in these stories, that I just thought that's the way it was, and I thought that's what it is that I had to put up with. And so finding a way to now meet with, instead of, say, dozens of inquiries or complaints every year, we're now looking at hundreds, right? And so how is it that we then take this moment and find a way to positively shift the culture and look to better ways for prevention, for protection, make sure people are aware of their avenues for recourse and the way to recover, so that it isn't a matter of, well, this happened to me, and so I'm going to leave the business, because apparently that's just the way it is. But actually find a way that a generation from now, and hopefully not quite that long, but hopefully I can put myself out of a job, right? You shouldn't need to have someone do these kinds of remedial things in order to make the effect that we want. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that we were able to get these people together on this panel today to talk about this, because clearly there is a movement towards finding a way to collectively look at these issues throughout our membership and throughout the industry that we work in.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Adam. Laura, could you tell us a little bit, when Adam talks about this particular moment in time, and as I said earlier, being at Gloria Steinem's, the celebration for the 45th anniversary of the magazine, she was talking about looking at this specific moment in time and how people are speaking out, people are actually organizing in ways that we've never seen people organize before. So that is kind of going back to my example of danger and opportunity, that's the opportunity that we're currently at. Talk to us a little bit about context, legal context in this way.
Well, we certainly have seen this before. I mean, Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill was a similar moment in time, and it didn't last. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is to keep up the momentum of, you know, encouraging people both to come forward. And there's a huge, as you've seen with Harvey Weinstein, huge strength in numbers. If more than one person complains, they will be believed. And it is, you know, it is enormously powerful if many people come forward. And so that's part of it, I think. And then the other piece of it, I think, is the shift in dynamic that is very new, because that didn't happen with Anita, is there's a presumption of belief. There's a presumption that she or he is telling the truth, and that is very new. And that's what I hope lasts, because that is very new. And I think if you shift the presumption is, why on earth would somebody be raising this if it weren't true? That should be the presumption. And that is what's shifting, and I think we need to keep really pushing that, because that's the important change.
And now, Lydia, just in terms of the Producers Guild of America, as we all saw the headlines and, you know, sort of from my perspective, sort of shock and scandal and disappointment, right? How internally, what were some of the issues that PGA had to go through as a Producers Guild to think about how you wanted to organize? And since you had this initiative that you had already developed, talk to us a little bit about procedurally, what are the things you'd like to see moving forward?
Well, I think we're, you know, this is an informal network of guilds, and we all talk to each other and have had a lot to say with each other about the issue. And in many ways, we're in the same place, because the PGA National Board formed an anti-sexual harassment task force. I know the DGA, the WGA, SAG, everybody is really looking at their programs with a new eye, because the interest level is different. The game has changed. I think one of the things that has been really an interesting topic of conversation, and it also relates back to the culture issue, is that, you know, while it is illegal for retaliation to happen, you know, for a reporter, we all know that culturally we live in a place where it happens freely. And there's not a lot of data on sexual harassment, but the EEOC has data, and they estimate that only 25% of workplace incidents are reported. And of those cases that are reported, 75% experience retaliation. So I think that, you know, this is an arena that we all have to, you know, really take a close look at and figure out what we can do. And it is very much about the culture, because I think there's a real lack of clarity societally about the definition of misconduct. And so there are certain things that are very clear, and when you look at things like consent, I mean, that consent is a very complicated issue. I think these are things that, you know, will be probed and explored much more deeply than we've ever, you know, looked at them before in all of our guilds and organizations.
Lowell, speak to us a little bit. You mentioned before what's happening in Albany and the diversity initiative that you, in terms of writers, that you've been working on. I think for the audience, it would be important to, for those of you who don't know about that policy work, could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, thanks. I'd be glad to. In fact, it's very timely. For the first time, the first state in the country has passed a tax incentive to hire women and people of color to write and to direct television in New York. And it's because a lot of people here made a lot of phone calls and went up to Albany to push hard for it. And now we have to do it again to make sure the governor signs it. One of the things that we have talked about when we go to Albany is the connection between diversity in the writer's room and diversity in storytelling. I was thinking about that as you were talking about how you changed the on-screen narrative. the stories that are being told, the stories that are being distributed on television, online, in theaters, need to reflect people's experiences, and I think that the work that we're doing with respect to this tax credit will shift what people watch. And we've been talking about it from the perspective of engaging audiences. We haven't been talking about it from a normative perspective, but I think the same thing is true. You would have different stories if more women were writing them. You simply would, just as you would have more different stories if you had more people of color writing them. And this tax incentive is an opportunity. Everybody knows about the lack of diversity in television and film and online. It's something that a lot of us have been talking about for decades. What hasn't happened is change. The numbers haven't changed. What this tax incentive would do would be to change the numbers. We would actually start diversifying hiring, which is at the root of it. We also have been involved, and I know this is true of the other unions and guilds as well, in building more opportunities for talented women and people of color to actually build careers. The barriers that exist to advancing your career are not that much different. The consequences are different, the behavior is different, but they're not that much different from the kinds of dynamics that lead to sexual harassment and other sexual misconduct on the job. It's a lot of people with a lot of power and not a lot of sensitivity. So we have, for example, done a fellowship where we've recruited a dozen women and people of color to write TV pilots. And the thought is, and believe me, their scripts are much more attuned than some of the stuff you see. The idea is that not that there are women and people of color who need a leg up because they don't have the talent and they don't have the experience. It's because the barriers exist and we have to overcome those barriers. And those are I'm repeating myself a little bit, but those are the same barriers that lead to the culture of sexual opportunism, sexual violence that we are addressing in tonight's panel. I think it's all of a piece. I don't want to minimize the horror of actual sexual violence, which is what we're talking about, but it is not distinct from the deeper cultural problem.
Now, Adam, I've received probably, I think it was 7 or 8 questions. And I had my list of questions for SAG-AFTRA, but one of the questions is, will SAG-AFTRA, as a consequence of what has happened, provide any additional resources to women? And I received that from different, from members of the audience as well as people calling me saying, oh, you're going to be on a panel, could you ask this question? Mm-hmm. So is that something that you're thinking about as an organization? Or?
I can't imagine that any of our organizations aren't looking at any ways that we can't bolster what it is that we currently do and explore ways that we can do things that haven't been done before. So the short answer is yes. And I would make sure that we're clear on this. It's not just for women, right? This is about the power imbalance we've talked about. This is anyone who is taken advantage of, anyone who's exploited, anyone who is a victim of someone who wants to exploit their real or perceived power. In this industry. So whether it is, so we have certain things in place, right? There is 844 Safer Set. There is a 24/7 hotline that people can call. There is the,
are people aware of that in the audience?
Well, I don't know, let's find out. Anybody?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good.
Okay. That's fabulous.
And there is, so that was, it's set up for, on-set emergencies or, hey, I'm in trouble, I'm in distress, I need to talk to my union about what's going on. As Lowell mentioned, right, I mean, this is beyond the collective bargaining agreement, right? This is sort of envisioned, from the union perspective of, hey, there's something that's going on that's violating my rights under the collective bargaining agreement. What we're talking about here is beyond that. Certainly we all have provisions in our agreements that say the employers will abide by applicable federal and state law and city law to not break the law. Mm-hmm. And we will then take those calls and we will make sure that people know what their rights are, how to avail themselves of it, whether it's to find legal counsel, how to get in touch with the city, state, federal agencies that regulate these things, how the union might be able to intervene in the moment when something's actually going on, right? Let's be real. I mean, somebody calls us and they have all of these options to explore about what they may want to do about it. And we want to make sure that they know what that is. But what role do we have in actually intervening to disrupt the behavior so that as they're trying to figure it out, that no one else is putting us in danger, right? How is it that we can have somebody on set, have somebody go to an audition so that at least they know that they're not operating in the shadows. That in that moment we can shine a light on what's going on so that while individuals can figure out what it is they may want to do about it in terms of recourse and how they can seek out the recovery resources that are available to them to recover from those traumas and to heal from what it is that has happened, that the union has the ability to actually disrupt what's going on in the moment. But whether it's legislatively and looking at paths to recourse are there, the levers are there, some of them suck, right? The statute of limitations in some places are terrible, right? The burden of proof is terrible, that somebody actually has to rise to the level of severe and pervasive. You know, what does that mean? And so we're exploring all the avenues that we possibly can to actually meet the demand as people are more and more coming forward. It used to be that the most difficult thing was to have somebody come forward and say, this has happened and what do I do? It's a different environment now, and it's people want to speak up, want to do something, but when you see the levers that people have or the things that people have at their disposal aren't great. So people take to social media, right, to share their stories and tell their truth. Well, these people are getting letters from lawyers that say, I'm going to sue you for slander, cease and desist. Right, so what are the ways that we can take advantage of technologies, the way that we can, at the same time of maintaining the confidence of somebody who talks to their union, but connect the dots up when people are talking about the same alleged perpetrators? How do we actually take advantage of some of the things that are being done on college campuses or other places to actually give people good tools to not only take action in terms of recourse, but also recovery? And so, and I'll just say this, that we're looking at everything that we do in terms of our own collective bargaining agreements, our own policies, our own educational events, legislative fixes, and any ways that we can work together so that, again, we don't have to have this conversation anymore.
Thank you. Lydia?
I just wanted to say, because I think we're all in leadership positions here, and I think there's a lot of people in the room who are in leadership positions, and I've been really quite moved, you know, over the past month or so in the conversations in the rooms that I've been in as a producer and as a guild member, of the difference between women who are talking who have been silent for so long because the culture, you know, we all struggle to sort of make it in a man's world. We want to show that we can measure up. We want to show that we can succeed. We want to show that we don't rock the boat. And therefore, a lot of stuff gets pushed down. And now there's been permission to let it bubble up and actually look at it in a different way than we ever have before. And I see a lot of women experiencing a re-traumatization of things that they may have spent years in therapy or may have been deflected out of jobs or may, you know, have all kinds of consequences from harassment and abuse. On the other side of the table, it's very interesting to see what is happening with many men, which is, I've been very moved by the fact that I'm hearing things like, I talked to my wife and she told me this story, I'd never heard it before. Or I talked to my daughters and they tell me they've experienced this. They had never said that to me before. And it's, we're talking about families, you know, and this has been, I mean, this has been quite significant. And I think that what we're experiencing is, you know, a real shift in our perspectives and the way we can talk to each other, the way we can come together. But honestly, I think that even to get to the solutions, we need this time of, you know, of understanding. Like if an employer says, we've worked together for so long, it's time, don't you think it's time I see you naked? Can we think about that from the woman's point of view? Okay, I was just joking. But then the woman, every time the woman comes into the room to have a meeting, is she taking up brain space of her productivity to think about that comment and how to push it back, how to get past it, how not to think about it? Did the person actually think it was a joke? And because, you know, on and on and on. So there are many, many things that I think in terms of our culture of our workplace, important conversations to have, and it's important to create spaces for people to have these conversations with each other.
Absolutely. Lillian, I wanted, in terms of healing, one of the things I was thinking as prepping again for this panel, I kept on thinking, I was a science student, and I always looked at big problems, and I used to try to break my science problems down to littler problems, and then try to figure out which ones I could solve and which ones I couldn't solve, and then which ones I needed help from other people to solve. And I think we're in that same situation currently. And I just wonder, again, from your perspective, what are the ways in which potentially we can be on a path toward using a crisis, this crisis, but then thinking about what are the steps toward healing, and the power that's reflected even this evening and in the room. There has to be a way that we think long term, how do we get to that place?
I would say we have to first, I think, come to terms that it is a trauma, and it's a sexual violence. It's the most prevalent sexual violence against women today, and has been for decades, actually. And it certainly affects men. It affects women to much higher degrees, just from the statistical point of view. So when we talk about healing, we have to think about what has somebody experienced, and why it's so important to seek support. And I think certainly, who do I tell? Why is it important to talk to somebody? And I think Laura can speak to the law in terms of confiding in someone at the time and going back and all of those things. But to seek support is something that can be really terrifying, actually, because you have to then come to terms with it. It's really affected you. It means that you have to process it, you need to think about it, and to think of steps moving forward. Individual support is certainly something, we're New Yorkers, we're in therapy, right? Most of us. So we're familiar with the concept. But, what does it mean to really understand how you're going to continue to move forward in this field, in knowing that this is out there? I think to speak to that is partly understanding the uniqueness of this field and the issues that it faces. We think of just stepping onto a set. What are those unique things that are there? A lot of the studies really show that if you have multiple employers, you know less about your rights as an employee. So right there, we have this baseline, right? That if people have multiple employers, they're less likely to know their rights, they're less likely to know policy, things like that. We also have to really honor the fact that this industry functions in a real informal networking type of way, and that informal networking creates so many opportunities to be working while you're not working, right? To be in the industry and functioning in that way, and so that creates more opportunities for things to happen. And there's also this idea of aesthetic labor. In this industry in particular, we use our image as a form of labor. And in those types of industries, we do have more opportunity for sexual harassment. I think people have already spoken to that, imagery and how we perceive our bodies and our images. So all of those things are something that if you've experienced sexual harassment in this industry, you might continue to have to navigate. And so that's why I think it's so important to seek some support, whether that's individual, whether that's group support, whether that's your own personal network, because there's so many factors that's unique. I think that's specifically why the Actors Fund can be so beneficial, because we're working with the industry. And in terms of healing, I think it's important to know that everybody is going to experience something differently. There's no right way to feel after something like this might happen to you. That's something that, certainly people, even in this room, might think, well, I had something happen and I'm okay, or, I haven't thought about it. And that's certainly, okay too. But to feel comfortable knowing that even if it's something that at the time it didn't, seem to upset you or to affect you much, that you might, at some point come to understand it in a different way. And I think it's been brought up, all of these stories that we're hearing might trigger people to remember some of their own stories. And is it now time to seek that support that perhaps you didn't seek at some point?
Lowell?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that we as, from a union perspective, you know, we are sort of power and policy folks. That's how we think. We think of economics, we think of power dynamics, and one of the things that we as a union have to pay attention to, and our reps have to pay attention to, is that there's an entirely different dimension to the work that we're talking about embarking on. It is not simply enough to say, all right, we have a claim, or we have to rectify this thing in a policy perspective. There are real experiences that are very difficult experiences. And not all union reps are really accustomed to thinking that way. So when we invite members to come to the union, we have to be prepared to think about that in a way that's a little unfamiliar. And I think it's important. I think we need to do it. And I think we are committed to doing our best. But it is not a natural role for a sort of fighting political economic organization. And we need to own that and change the way we think about these issues and approach them in a way that's sensitive and helpful and not that doesn't just foster more denial.
Laura, could you speak to us a little bit again about one of the concerns that I had was retaliation could take place in various ways. How legally can folks be informed about the whole issue of retaliation and what they should understand as steps to take?
Retaliation is a huge problem, and if somebody says, you know, well, it's illegal, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And it does happen. It realistically does happen. And I tell everybody I consult with, you know, you need to expect this and it might happen. On the other hand, I also tell people that the retaliation claim is the easiest claim to win in the world. And those ones, like, you know, I can't tell you how many times people lose in court on their discrimination claim and they win on the retaliation claim. And the retaliation claim is where all the money is because that's why they lost the job. So, I mean, it's not that what anybody wants, and that's another thing I always tell people, the goal, who wants a lawsuit? Nobody wants a lawsuit. People want a career. They don't want a lawsuit. But there is protection, and there's more protection. The more you speak out, the more protection you have. And so not telling the whole story or just telling one coworker and not reporting it is kind of the worst of all worlds because you don't potentially have the retaliation protection because they can claim they don't know about it. So, you know, if you're going to make a complaint, make it big. You know, make sure you tell everyone, you know, the important people, so that nobody can say they didn't know, and that's, you know, and therefore claim they're not retaliating against you. So, again, it's a very serious decision about how far to go and whether to report something because retaliation does happen, and that's where I go back to the strength in numbers. You know, the more people who are complaining about the same thing, the less likely it is there will be any retaliation because it's a very different dynamic. But yes, it's a problem. One can easily say that you have this protection, but that doesn't answer, you know, where your career will go. And I just want to say one other thing about you're talking about the healing and the resources and everything, and I think that's very, very important. There's been a lot of studies about a lot of victims of sexual harassment in the workplace have been victims before, sometimes of parental, abuse. People who are victims sometimes are victims before, and that comes bubbling up when they experience a sexual harassment. I've had more than one client who, when they came to me about a sexual harassment problem, told me they had also been abused by their father. And my immediate reaction to that is, I will not represent you unless you are getting help. I can't. I don't have qualifications. You need some serious help. But it's very common that people who are victims in the employment have been victims before, and that's why they really need resources and they need support.
Thank you. Adam, I know you've been traveling West Coast, East Coast. Are there similar conversations I saw on the website that are happening West Coast? Are there any lessons that we can learn from potential collaborations or anything we should know about what's happening right now? And this week, I know you were at another session. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. And if I could just real quick, picking up on the retaliation piece before I get to that, yes. I think it's again, sort of a unique factor in this industry, right? That it's one thing you you have a kind of a straight job, right? You go into work every day and you make a complaint, and the next day you get demoted or you get fired, or as you start getting treated differently. It's a little bit easier to make that connection between, well, I made that claim and now this is the treatment I'm getting. In a business when you have multiple employers, there's so many different decision makers, from agents to casting directors to producers and directors and studios, who are making these decisions about who gets in the room and who gets jobs. And all anybody ever has to say is, I'm sorry, you're just not right for this, right? And all of a sudden, your agent goes away, and all of a sudden your phone stops ringing. Making that connection between that thing that I said about these people over here and all of a sudden my job opportunities dry up in other places is a real risk, is a real fear of that retaliation and retribution that is, again, I think somewhat unique to our industry. Not to discourage people, right? I'm not discouraging people from coming forward, certainly, but it's something to consider that is different from the way it plays out in other industries. I think is a real thing to think about.
Can I just follow up on that, which is why I've read a lot of, because again of Weinstein, a lot of people are urging that confidentiality agreements should be illegal. But, your point, these people need to have some protection, and my clients want the confidentiality frequently just as much as the employer does, because if it never goes to court and it's settled out of court, nobody knows about it. So the potential for that retaliation from the next employer is much, much, much more limited. So
almost an impossible calculation for someone to make, right? I want to speak out. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else.
It's very difficult.
However, I don't want to jeopadize my own career. I mean, it's real. It's
very difficult.
But to your point, yes. So I was in Atlanta last week because in 2013 they had 0 sound stages, and now they have 50, right? And those are actual physical locations. But when an employer can just be anybody with a cell phone, and this work can happen anywhere. It was months and months ago, pre-Weinstein, that I was invited to come to the Atlanta membership meeting to talk about harassment and discrimination, as there is more and more work and more opportunities for people to exploit their power in those situations. Their board of directors said, come down and talk to our members about this. So I was in Atlanta, I was in LA earlier this week. Our elected leaders and our senior officials have been, this is being talked about internationally, right, with our Federation of International Artists and resolutions against sexual violence and sexual harassment. The AFL-CIO just last month. So this is not just a clear-cut labor management issue, right, but clearly labor is looking at this very, very carefully across all the industries. And as horrific as some of the things that our members go through, there are people, workers across all industries that are facing similar challenges when they try to go to work and have people stand in their way and try to make them do things they don't want to in order to make their way in the business. So we're looking at this. It's coming up organically from our own membership. It's coming from our partners in all of the other creative arts industries. And slowly but surely, it's also coming from the people who are responsible primarily for this, from the employer standpoint. And so whatever we can do to mobilize as many people who this affects, and it's everybody, we are going to take advantage of that. And I think, one thing I wanted to say about Lillian, if anybody thinks that nobody gets what it is that everybody goes through, they get it, right? I don't know if you heard that, but she has a very nuanced understanding of the way the industry works. And so it may not be that traditional resources and the traditional work environment actually makes a lot of sense for people who make their living doing what it is that you all do. But there is an incredible resource in the Actors Fund and the people who are there because they understand this on a level that is difficult to do without long-standing personnel and institutional knowledge of how the industry works. So take advantage of what it is that they do.
Lydia, just again, in terms of producers, so currently, if anyone wanted to either participate in the culture shift and any, I have to say the Ms. Initiative, what should they do so that they can get involved?
Well, on our handout, we have an email address that if people would like to send us their anecdotes, we have some sample questions for the culture shift lens that you could try out on your, if you're a content creator, you could try it out on your slate. And we're curious to know if you have sort of uncovered any kind of bias in your content. What happened when you talked to your collaborators or your studio network executive, and did something change, and how did the conversation go? So we're collecting this information now for the project, and then we will put the online resource up in the spring of 2018. But I just want to say I've been very interested in kind of studying the cognitive models that very well-known finance entrepreneurs use, because most of them use models. Most of them don't just trust their own, intuition or perspective. They have, they have decision trees. They have cognitive bias checklists, and these are for investments. So I found that very interesting, and that's kind of what we're looking to do with Culture Shift, which is to create a lens with a checklist of questions. So we have an example of, if you're portraying sexual violence on screen, in the handout you'll see a list of questions that you can ask yourself. Did you portray the emotional aftermath of the victim, survivor? Is the incident just a narrative plot point, or is the character multidimensional and not just defined by the event? How does the script present consent, or does not depict consent? These are like questions that, and in Culture Shift, we will have any number of areas, because it's not just gender related, but it will include all vulnerable groups or groups that are suffering, at the erasure or invisibility of our culture. So this is something that we're hoping will take hold and will actually be a positive force, and also for people to really think you have to get out of your wheelhouse. You have to learn how to be an active listener and surround yourself with the world that looks like the world we live in, and not just the world that you've subscribed to because it looks like you.
Thank you, Lydia. In terms of Lowell, I know you mentioned the diversity initiative that's currently, in Albany. Are there things that people specifically need to know about your timeline?
Yes, call the governor as soon as you leave here.
I didn't say that, he did.
No, seriously, he can act at any time between now and the end of the year. So if you're interested in supporting the legislation, this is the time to do it. We don't know yet what he's going to do, and this is a moment of real opportunity to make concrete change.
Now, Adam, I'm looking at the notes, and I've received this question several times, so I will ask it. Is SAG-AFTRA going to consider new language in your contracts with production companies?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't see any reason why not to. And we have, we're looking at this, holistically, right? As we all have, whether it's not just looking at this one issue, which is clearly vital, but looking at it through the rubric of everything else that we do, whether it's the inclusivity and the diversity, and trying to make sure that we have that. We have President Carteris's Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety. That this is also, we have a group of member and executive leaders that are going to be working with the various task forces that are being set up at the other unions, so that we have a group of member leaders also looking at who are sitting in these negotiations, will be it our TV and movie producers, our commercial producers, our independent producers. There's not anything that we're not looking at to crack open and figure out how can we take what it is that we think we have now and make it better.
Thank you. I know we are close to time, I believe, but I wanted to give everyone 30 seconds. Closing. We'll start with you, Lillian.
I would say just encourage you to reach out to the Actors Fund. If you even just want 45 minutes of someone to talk to hold the space, to explain to you a little bit about what the process might look like if you'd like to file a claim, or you're interested in learning more, or just a place to breathe. We're certainly here for you. So we encourage you to reach out. We are having some group process available in the coming weeks for people who might want to get some groups and peer support. And those, I think, are listed right on the program.
There's a handout
Yes,
in the
so certainly reach out. Yeah.
Adam? Thank you. Lillian.
Speak up, stand up, right? We've heard a lot about that and the power of numbers and how vital that is. I'm going to say something maybe a little different that I'm going to steal a little bit from some of the things that you and I talked about. But I think it's critical that standing up and speaking out is going to be a very painful process for a long time until we hit this culture shift where it is always the presumption of belief. And that's just what it is. And until we hit that place, it's going to be hard for a long time. And that is also a reactive thing that is necessary to move us in this direction. But I'd say that what is unique about everyone in this room and the people that we represent is your ability to change the dynamic through the stories you tell. Right? No one else gets to see in the way that happens in this industry who works, who doesn't, the relationships and how healthy and how not. And so the stories you tell, the people you choose to tell them with, I think have an incredible impact, not just on our industry, but on the world at large. So take very close a look at the things that the change the PGA is doing and really take a look at, well, what are you doing? Who are you telling those stories with? And how are you telling those stories? Because beyond what happens to you individually, I think you can really take this moment and start creating content that actually shifts the narrative.
Well, I would like to pick up on the idea that there's strength in numbers. That is fundamentally the union project. Our strength is our numbers. Obviously, we know how to negotiate contracts and lobby in Albany and Washington, but fundamentally, it's about the strength of the members. And the more that members of our unions are engaged in tackling this really deep-seated, long-standing problem, the more successful we're going to be.
Thank you, Lowell.
The thing that we maybe haven't completely knocked on the head tonight that I'd like to just mention is it's been a very sort of unsettling and confusing time for all of us, any of us, because there is this element of complicity that we're all coming around to. The fact that no matter who you are, what you've experienced, whatever setting you're in, we are all complicit. And this idea that the roof is kind of blown off and we don't have to be anymore, I mean, is a real opportunity, to your point, Cynthia, and the converse of crisis. I mean, it's a real opportunity that, you know, we should no longer be bystanders. We should no longer be enablers, that we really have to look at the way we interact with everyone in our community, our family, our workplace, and really, you know, actively listen and really encourage the conversations that will create a deeper understanding of society overall.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lydia. Laura?
If all employees had the resources and the support your members have, we would all be a lot better off. So, I mean, it is amazing to hear about the Actors Fund and all these resources that you have, and that is what people need. That is what people need. The other thing I would say is we haven't talked much about whose ultimate responsibility this all is, and that's the employers. They have a lot of responsibilities they have not been fulfilling. You guys can make them do it. I can sometimes make them do it. Individuals can make them, but unions have more power to make them do it than any individual. So, you know, it's the onus is on them to clean up their house, to investigate, to throw the bums out when they're doing bad stuff, and, you know, go get them.
Thank you, Laura. Now we have a couple of questions from the audience. I think, Lowell, this is for you. What is the exact name of the legislation you would like to have us call the governor about?
Yes, thank you. I realized I sort of forgot. It is the Television Diversity Tax Credit. It is sponsored by Senator Alcantara from the Bronx, S499D. I'll say that again, Television Diversity Tax Credit, S499D. Operators are standing by. Emails, letters, phone calls, visits.
Information on the website that's very clear about this,
Yes.
right? Yes. Adam, since support from other victims has helped empower other victims to come forward, what is the specific additional support to create change and address these issues? I guess you sort of you've addressed this in different ways. You're looking at a plethora of ideas across the board from contract, but I guess they're asking, will there be additional resources for the victims?
I suppose that's up to my bosses. But yes, I think that we must. I mean, and maybe something that's in there, I'm sure I understand that totally, but is empowering people through knowledge of their rights, which we've done here today, I think, but also empowering people through a sense of community. And this idea that when people come forward and they know that they're not alone and they're not the first, and the power in that. And so we are trying to figure out ways, if anyone here calls us, we want to maintain a certain level of confidentiality, right? Because that's important for someone to feel comfortable when they're speaking up in something that may have taken them quite a long time to come to terms with themselves. We don't want to do anything to betray that sense of confidence, but at the same time try to find a way to connect them up with other folks who may have come forward without betraying that confidence. And we do need to do a better job to figure it out, and we're working on it.
Cynthia, there also are, you know, it's too early to talk about it for this industry, but there are tech applications that are out there. I mean, given that 90% of perpetrators are repeat offenders, there are apps like Callisto is one that is being piloted for campus assault. 15 to 20 colleges are piloting it right now, and it's a way of people reporting into a cloud, an escrow cloud, and the report stays there until someone else reports the same perpetrator, so that this idea that the repeat offender is being identified by a third party. There are different things like that that are being explored, and I think with the age that we live in with tech, I think there's going to be solutions that we'll hear about in times to come.
Absolutely. Another question. How will sexual harassment be addressed for extras? What exactly does the union deem or consider sexual harassment for people who are not yet members but are on their way to that employment?
Oh, I think that's a good question. At least for us, I mean, you can, if you're working on one of our jobs, if you're working under a union contract, union member or not, we will still want to provide you with all of the same ideas about resources in terms of rights and recourse. And I know that power dynamic we've talked about is particularly extreme when it comes to the background community, right? And so I think that is a particularly vulnerable group of people that this happens to. And so union, non-union, background principal, you know, recording artist, broadcaster, performer, it doesn't matter. The law defines it under a certain way. It applies to everyone. So give us a call. We'll make sure that we can get you to folks like the Actors Fund or others who can give you the best idea about what your recourses are.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, and I want to thank the panel so much for participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.